Thank you for joining us. I'm here today with Christina Lee, and for her webinar on Theistnormativity. Christina is an assistant professor at the University of South Dakota. She has her PhD in communication studies from Colorado State University, and her research focuses on the intersection of religion and political rhetoric, with a particular focus on secular criticism, Christian nationalism, and the marginalization of atheists. So Christina, I'm very happy to have you here today for the webinar, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen real quick. So if there's any issues seeing that, please let me know. All right, so again, I'm going to be talking about this conception of theistnormativity and really how it relates to this idea of developing language, both about how people in power create language that marginalizes atheists, but also how those who are atheists or non-theistic can create language to call out the marginalization. So just a quick note, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the term atheist primarily to describe people who do not believe in God, but I do want to recognize that not everyone uses that term to describe themselves, even if they do not believe in God. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that relates to theistnormativity and those types of ideas. So, all right. So I want to start by talking about a couple of key assumptions that guide my research that are really important for kind of my field in general. I am a professor in communication studies, specializing in rhetoric. So one of the key assumptions that guides my entire field really is that our communication constructs the world that we live in. And so language is really powerful because it doesn't just describe the world, it really does shape how we understand who we are, how other people are. And what's really important about understanding language in this sense is that words and their meaning are human inventions and can change over time across cultures and from person to person. And so there's power in looking at language to understand how what it tells us about culture, ideology, and how shifts in languages can help us understand how power is changing in a culture. Another really important theory that drives a lot of the work that I do is a theory called muted group theory. And this is an idea that a language within a particular culture does not really serve all speakers equally, because not all speakers contribute to an equal fashion to its formation. So really what this means is that when you look at any particular culture, language is primarily created by, circulated, and normalized by dominant groups, which means that the language that we tend to have access to really tends to favor the worldview and experiences of those with power. And this manifests in a lot of different ways, but one of the things that ends up happening with this is that this includes language and narratives about marginalized groups themselves, and this can perpetuate stereotypes. So for example, if we look at the term atheist, the term itself has been largely defined by those in power, and it tends to be associated with a lot of negative terms. So idea of being atheist is automatically anti-theist or anti-Christians, particularly in the United States. It's oftentimes framed in relation to being angry or being framed next to communism, so being un-American in that sense. So that's something that really shapes how people see atheists as a whole, and it's usually not in the most positive light. In a similar way, the way that these narratives are promoted by dominant groups can really shift how we understand what is considered civil or polite discourse. So for example, in a similar vein, if we look at the term blasphemy, within any culture, there tends to be this idea that the dominant religious groups gets to define blasphemy as insult to that religion, but you can insult any other religion and it's not a big deal. And so that's a way that dominant groups can define what counts as civil discourse or not, is what religions are you allowed to or not allowed to insult before it's called blasphemy. So this means that for many marginalized groups, it can be really hard to articulate themselves because they don't have language necessarily that describes their experiences. And even when they try to create it, sometimes it can be hard to circulate it. And we'll talk a little more about that in a little bit. But this also means that marginalized groups have to translate their thoughts before speaking to fit into a more dominant worldview. So another example of this would be in the United States, for example, the conception of morality is largely defined in religious terms. So when somebody who is religious asks, how can an atheist be moral? It can be really hard for an atheist to explain that, because within our dominant culture, we understand morality as inherently tied to religion. So it can be really difficult to explain how you cannot be religious and still be moral because of the way it's understood through dominant discourses. So what's really important about this is that there are strategies to resist being muted. And one of them is to point out language that mutes people, to also celebrate and promote the languages of marginalized groups. So thinking about how, for example, we can look at how do atheist groups define atheism rather than defining it by the dominant group. Because one of the things you oftentimes see happen is people will say, well, I'm not religious, I don't believe in God, but I'm not an atheist, which suggests that they're defining atheism through this dominant lens rather than celebrating and promoting the way it's defined by atheist groups. And similarly, another thing that they can do is to actually change language to try to be more inclusive and to actually try to find names and language to explain their personal experiences as a marginalized group. So this brings me to the conception of theistnormativity that I've been working on for about the last 6 years. So this is generally this expectation that people will believe in God, or at least publicly embrace theistic recognitions, rituals, and symbols. So one of the things that's important about this expectation is that when people fail to meet this expectation, they're oftentimes framed within dominant discourses as a threat, as a danger to democracy, and particularly in the United States, this belief in God and this kind of reverence to theistic symbolism tends to be associated with good citizenship. So to not do this oftentimes gets you framed as un-American, as a threat to democracy, and et cetera. So I'm really interested in thinking about, in my work, how does theist normative mindsets get reinforced through political discourses, as well as what are the implications for non-theists in their day-to-day lives. And this means that my research kind of looks in a lot of different areas. Right now, I'm particularly focusing on political discourses, but I'm hoping to kind of expand this, and I'll talk more about that throughout the presentation. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that theistnormativity is connected to other forms of normativity. It's not this kind of silo idea. So for example, there's a broader concept called theonormativity that Chris Stedman proposed around the 2010, 2012-ish, and this was more broadly the normalization of religion. And I think this is an important kind of overarching framework to think how within our culture, religion broadly is normalized. But within this kind of broader umbrella, I argue that there's also more narrow manifestations of normativity and religious normativity. And the one that I look at specifically is the way that belief in God specifically is normalized. And it's for various particular reasons, thinking about the way that the use of the term God is so prominent within politics, and how even if we think about like the normalization of religion, religion is oftentimes defined in very theist normative ways in Western cultures that exclude ideas like atheistic religions. But also, there's another manifestation of theonormativity that is Christonormativity. So in the United States, both of these tend to be quite Christian focused. And so we can't really separate all of them. They're all connected. But particularly because I'm so focused on the marginalization of atheists specifically, theistnormativity tends to be what I focus on. And hopefully as I continue this presentation, you'll understand why I use this particular term. So I'm kind of looking at several different manifestations of theistnormativity, and I'm not going to go into all of them in detail on this presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A afterwards. And I'm also a professor, so if there's any undergrads looking at going to grad school, always looking for grad students who want to do research in different areas. There's a lot of different ways to explore this. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is thinking about the way that atheism and non-theism are defined, and how that kind of reinforces theist normative narratives, stereotypes, how like morality is tied to theism, things like that. That's one focus that I kind of mentioned already in this presentation. Another one is just theistnormativity in our everyday interactions. So this is really what pushed me to research this in the first place. So I'll talk a little bit more about that today. And then the next is theistnormativity specifically in politics. This is where the majority of my current research is really looking at. And then the relationship between theistnormativity and Christonormativity, I think, is really important because oftentimes theistnormativity is used to mask and hide Christian privilege. Theistnormative discourses are often used by Christian nationalists in order to present themselves as being inclusive when they're actually trying to promote Christianity specifically. So I'll touch on that very briefly at the end of my presentation, but I'm again happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But I think it's important through all of this to recognize, thinking about theistnormativity and its intersection with other forms of normativity and marginalization, recognizing that different people with different identities are going to experience theistnormativity differently, thinking for how different theistic religions are privileged and marginalized in different ways through theistnormative discourses. So that's just something to always keep in mind through this, is that this is a very complex topic that does not apply equally to all people, and it's good to be mindful of that. So I want to start thinking about this in terms of theistnormativity in everyday life. Again, this is what probably really started my interest in this topic. I know for me personally, I grew up religious and then became an atheist over time. And one of the things that I noticed once I became an atheist was how often people in my day-to-day life would just assume that I believed in God, or would assume that I was religious broadly, tying back to that more broad theonormativity. And I mean, I'm sure that this happened a lot when I was religious and I just didn't notice it. But once I became an atheist, it was much more noticeable to me how often I would have to make very split-second decisions about whether or not to let people know that they were making a false assumption about me, and how I oftentimes felt pressured to pass as theistic for various reasons. I felt like either if I was open about being an atheist in a certain situation, I'd be framed as rude or overbearing just by saying that I was an atheist or correcting someone's assumption. How I felt like I was regularly pressured to participate in different religious activities, such as prayer to a god, things like that. This assumption that the default is to say an oath on a Bible or an oath to God, these types of things. And these kind of constant feeling like I had to decide whether or not I should pass as theistic or not. And this really bothered me. But I had a hard time explaining it to people. And when I met other people who were atheists, we would talk about it and be like, oh, you've had this experience too. But I found it really hard to explain to other people. So this is something that just always was in the back of my mind for several years before I got into graduate school. And the more that I do research, the more that I find that this is a really common phenomenon that people who are atheist or secular non-theists experience. So this is research from the Secular Survey that came out a couple of years ago. And it's notable that most people at least have some times where they choose to conceal their non-religious identity. And I think it's important to acknowledge that even this survey data might be slightly skewed in some ways, because to my knowledge, and I could be wrong about this if anyone knows more about this, this survey was largely advertised through atheist organizations and groups, which means that a lot of people taking this survey, I would assume, were already people who were comfortable being out atheists, at least in some group situations. So that might mean that people who are really uncomfortable coming out will be less inclined to have access to even seeing the survey. So I'd imagine this number is probably even greater if we look at broader numbers. But we see again that people do tend to at least sometimes hide their identity, particularly with strangers, is one of the biggest numbers and at work, so potential concern there. And if you look at the qualitative data, it's really interesting where people say, like, even if you're living in a liberal part of the country, you go by a don't ask, don't tell policy. So this kind of feeling like, even though like theoretically I think it's okay, there's a general part of culture that says actually it's not okay unless someone specifically asks you. Another interesting example was someone saying that they don't tell except for a select group of friends, and this is based on how they've been treated in the past, but they know this shouldn't be that way. So this, again, this idea that people just have a hesitancy to reveal that they're atheist, which means that amongst other people, they oftentimes just pass as theistic, and that's just, they let that assumption stay. Finally, I want to point to this qualitative response where someone said that the very act of taking this survey has revealed to me how much I hide my non-religious identity from the people around me for fear of harm, not to me, but to my livelihood. And I think this is a really important quote, because I think this is one that I see quite a bit, is how people oftentimes, they're so used to this experience of having to pass as theistic that it's just normal, that it doesn't even seem weird to us. We almost, for many people, they don't even recognize their own marginalization because it's so normalized. And we've just accepted that, you don't say, you don't cause the conflict by pointing out that someone's assumptions are wrong. You don't cause conflict by saying that you're an atheist, or just this idea that we oftentimes just accept it as reality rather than recognize it as marginalization until it's pointed out to us. So this is something, again, that's really the power of language, and one of the reasons why I like the term theistnormativity, or more broadly theonormativity, is the way that it does point out that there is normative behavior happening that is marginalizing groups of people, and it gives us language to be like, oh no, that's what's happening to me, is there's this normativity being pushed on me. And in a country that has freedom of religion and supposed religious equality and tolerance, why is that okay? So that's, I think, the power of that naming there. And I think we can see this in the way, too, that there are a lot of kind of coming out atheist folks, of the way that people are trying to encourage people to come out and help people through this, because it is really hard to fight this normativity. And just being an open atheist is a way to fight that normativity. But because culture in many ways discourages people from doing that, there's entire books written to help people go through that process. So now I want to talk about the idea of theistnormativity in politics. And really what I think is important here is that to understand why these are issues that are happening in our day-to-day lives, it's important to look at the narratives happening in the political sphere, because the political sphere shapes our reality. So this is a really a major assumption in work in political communication. A lot of work is done that looks at how political rhetoric in particular, and presidential rhetoric specifically, really does shape the way people understand who the people are in any country, but in the United States specifically is what I'm focusing on. And thinking about how we oftentimes pick up those narratives as they're circulated in politics. So in many ways, political discourses both reflect and influence how we understand the world. So one of a really interesting survey that really drove a lot of my research was one that was done by the Public Religion Research Institute. There was an initial survey that was done in 2015, which came out when I kind of first started doing my research, that found that 69% of Americans agreed with the statement that you need to believe in God to be truly American. And when I first read that, I was just shocked that that number was so high. So they did the survey again in 2021, and the good news is that number has gone down quite a bit. And I think that's largely thanks to the work of organizations that are trying to normalize atheism and non-theism and secularism broadly. I also think to some extent it's a demonstration of how Christian nationalist discourses can actually harm themselves when people get tired of that type of discourse. But even so, if we look at 2021, you'll see that there's still 56% of Americans who agree with the statement that believing in God is an important characteristic for being truly American. And what I really like about the more recent survey is they broke this down by political parties. So as you can see, approximately 80% of Republicans agree with this statement, so about 4 in 5 agree with that, which is a pretty large percentage. But I also think it's important to note that 45% of Democrats agree with this statement, so about 50%. I think there's a tendency when we talk about religious normativity or religion being pushed in different ways in society, we oftentimes think of it from the religious right. But I think it's important to acknowledge that theistnormativity is a cultural phenomenon that is not immune from any political party. It's something that's reinforced across political parties in different ways. But I also think, it's also important to acknowledge that being Christian is also another trait that people do think is sometimes important for being truly American, and these are oftentimes tied together and connected. But I think this is, again, why I think it's useful to have the conception of theistnormativity alongside Christonormativity, because there is a difference. While certainly a large number of people do agree that you need to believe in God to be truly American, an even larger amount is willing to be a little bit more broad and say you need to believe in God, thus being more inclusive, but they're still excluding atheists from ideas of religious pluralism when they do that. And so it's important to have these conversations about why. So this leads me to one of the first research projects that I did, which was looking very specifically at how presidents would talk about religion in their inaugural addresses. So this initially started as a project in which I looked at how presidents in all of their speeches talked about atheists throughout US history. And there were very few references. The few that existed, for the most part, weren't very nice, with just a few exceptions. Most of them were quite negative. But what I found to be more interesting was that when I was looking at major speeches by presidents, particularly speeches to the nation, such as inaugural addresses, while they very rarely specifically talked about atheists, the way that they talked about the American people was inherently theistic. They would constantly describe the American people as people who believed in God, or they would present the idea of God as a universal truth that all Americans accept. Or they would do things like tying belief in God to fundamental democratic values, like using the idea that our rights come from a creator, those types of discourses. And so in every inaugural address since 1933, you see examples of this. It doesn't matter the politician's political background or their political party, you see this in all of these different speeches, and it manifests in different ways. So for example, Republicans are more likely to explicitly describe the American people as theistic. Democrats still do this, but not as much. But Democrats are still quite likely to present the idea of God as a universal truth that's just assumed to be everyone that will accept that. So thinking about how this can shape how we understand who the American people are. They are a God-fearing, God-loving people. And how this discourse, even if it doesn't blatantly say anything about atheists, it subtly suggests that atheists are not part of presidential understanding of who the people are. So this also brings me to the way this is reinforced through what I call theist-normative legislation, which is one of the things I'm really interested in now. So this is legislation that encourages people to view themselves as a theistic collective. So this goes beyond just political discourse and just what a president says to actual legislation that gives this discourse and this narrative a sense of legitimacy. And the two probably most iconic examples of this are In God We Trust and the idea of one nation under God being pled into the Pledge of Allegiance. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that a good portion of this legislation is relatively recent. So the 1950s are this time of immense religious pressure. This is a time, there's a scholar named Jonathan Herzog who refers to the 1950s as a time of the rise of the spiritual industrial complex. and the way that people in power were really trying to pressure this narrative to get Americans to go back to God. There was a big spike in secularism in the decades leading up to the 1940s and 1950s. So this was largely in response to the rise of secularism. And so you see different legislation get passed, such as in 1952, Congress declared that the National Day of Prayer is going to be an annual event. So every year the president is required by law to declare a National Day of Prayer. And I argue that this is theist normative legislation because in the United States, prayer is just understood largely as prayer to a higher power. So it's very theistic in the way it's understood. Similarly, in 1954, a prayer room was added to Congress. That same year, Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And notably, it was justified by some of the major supporters of it by arguing specifically that an atheist American is a contradiction of terms. So literally framing atheists as un-American to justify why it's acceptable to put these words in a pledge said by all Americans. Just say that atheists aren't Americans, then you can justify doing it. And then also we get In God We Trust, which had previously just been on coins, on all money, and then it became our national motto. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this time frame in particular is that in 1954, the National Reform Association, which was one of the first organized Christian nationalist groups, was also trying to pass the Christian Amendment, but they failed. And a lot of the people who were in the National Reform Association have also been involved in some of the theist-normative legislation as well. But I think this goes to show how in the United States in particular, there tends to be a hesitancy, especially at the national level, to pass legislation that is explicitly Christonormative, but they are more willing across the political parties to promote legislation that is more theist normative, that broadly appears more inclusive of most religions, or at least most theistic religions, but not inclusive of atheism. And I want to say this like it's supposedly inclusive because I think it's important to acknowledge that while theist normative discourses present themselves as inclusive of all theistic religions, of course it really isn't, because I think when most people look at something like Under God or In God We Trust, they're not including Islam in that. So there's of course intersecting identities here and different levels of normativity playing out. But that's at least the justification. If you look at how judges have consistently defended the constitutionality of these types of discourses, they argue that theist normative legislation such as In God We Trust or Under God does not privilege one religion. It's broad and not referring to one religion, thus it's inclusive. It's one of the things that's really important about this in thinking about current implications is its connection to Christian nationalism, both historically and today. Now, really quickly, I want to define Christian nationalism because I think it's a very hot topic term right now that there's a lot of misunderstandings about. So Christian nationalism is very specifically a political ideology, or perhaps better understood as a political imaginary, where it's a way that people imagine democracy should look. Specifically, Christian nationalists believe that the United States is a Christian nation, or it should be a Christian nation, one of the two, that our laws should be based off of Christian values. And in current manifestations, it's typically conservative Christian values. There are liberal manifestations of Christian nationalism, but those aren't quite as popular today as conservative versions. And Christian nationalists also tend to believe that Christians make for the best citizens and best leaders. But what's really important about this is we're not talking about Christianity as a religion. We're talking about a political ideology. So not all Christians are Christian nationalists, and not all Christian nationalists are Christians. You can have Christian nationalists from any religious belief. You can have atheists who support the ideas of Christian nationalism. So it's not about religion itself, it's about political power broadly. So I actually just had this research paper that came out that looks at how Christian nationalists played a role in getting In God We Trust on money during the Civil War, how they helped get it kind of implemented throughout the 1900s, making it the national motto in the 1950s, the ways that they very explicitly were arguing that in God we trust is the Christian God. If you really look at the way they're defining it and the way they justify it, the way that they're very anti-atheist, and how throughout these discourses they frame atheism as the core threat to democracy. So really how in God we trust is a Christian nationalist discourse, but how they used theistnormativity to kind of hide the Christian nationalism behind it. And then looking at how contemporary Christian nationalists pretty consistently will use in God we trust as justification for their Christian nationalist narratives. So they'll point to that as proof that we're a Christian nation. They'll use it when trying to justify particular legislation. And they're actively trying to get in God we trust bills passed with the idea that if we pass in God we trust bills, it will be easier to pass more kind of Christonormative legislation, such as Bible literacy courses in schools or celebrations of Christian Heritage Weeks. And this will make it easier then to promote more specific Christian nationalist agendas tied to things like LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, and things like that. So what do we do? What do we do about theistnormativity? And whether we're atheists, secularists, whether you're theistic but just want to be a more inclusive, celebrate a more plural society, what do we do? First is, I would say there is power in naming experiences. This is one of the reasons why I developed the term theistnormativity. That doesn't mean that this is the best term. That doesn't mean it's the only term. If people have other ideas, but I think that in general there is power in naming marginalization and explaining those experiences, creating that language to be able to articulate and go back to those ways to resist muted group theory that I mentioned earlier. Those are all really important. The next, I think, with any normativity, especially in a way that a form of normativity that occurs when somebody has an invisible identity, is if you can be open about being an atheist or a non-theist, that can be really powerful. But I do want to acknowledge that that's really only something you should do if it's safe to do so, because everyone has different levels of privilege and marginalization, and not everybody has the support system to be able to do that. But if you do have the privilege to be able to be an open atheist, it can be a really powerful way to disrupt a lot of these stereotypes that are perpetuated through theistnormative discourses. Call out theistnormative practices when you see them. The great thing about this is that it's something that anyone can do, whether they're atheist, whether they're a closeted non-theist, whether they are theistic, is just, let's talk about how In God We Trust promotes theistnormativity. Let's talk about how Under God was justified by arguing that an atheist American was a contradiction in terms. If somebody is at a meeting and they say something like, everyone join me in prayer, call that out and say, you don't know that everyone here is religious. Like, let's change, either not do the prayer, or even just saying something like, if you would like to join me in prayer. That simple language change acknowledges that there is religious diversity and that not everyone is automatically going to want to join in, and giving people that agency to feel like they can make choices rather than feel as much pressure to join in. These are all really powerful things that we can do to challenge normative discourses. I think another one that's really important is to support organizations that promote safe places to express non-theistic beliefs and that publicly challenge theistnormativity. So anyone who's already involved in the Secular Student Alliance, like, you're already doing a really important step in challenging theistnormativity by growing these groups, by supporting the groups. So thinking about how you can, if you're not a member, going to their events, financially supporting the organization or local chapters. But beyond just the Secular Student Alliance, looking at, I think, local secular, free thought, humanist, atheist groups are a really powerful way to challenge theistnormative discourses at a more local level. Because if your neighbor knows you and knows you're a good person and then sees you out picking up trash with an atheist t-shirt on, it completely disrupts this assumption that morality is tied to belief in God. So there's a lot of power in supporting local groups like that as well. Another one that I think is really, really powerful is joining interfaith coalitions and engaging in interfaith coalitions for a couple of reasons. One, I think that interfaith coalitions at their core are about celebrating religious pluralism and doing better when it comes to promoting religious freedom, equality, and tolerance. But interfaith coalitions don't always, is not a place that a lot of atheists always think to go to. And I think that's really a powerful place to talk about these normative experiences to people who are open to listening and who are open to being allies in those situations. Furthermore, when it comes to challenging Christian nationalism, one of the most important groups for challenging it are people who are religious. And so it's a great place to build coalition building across the board for political issues that we care about. And finally, I would say it's important to educate yourself on the history of religious freedom, particularly, I'm going to say in the United States for the sake of this talk, but I think in general, that's really important. If we look at things like theistnormativity, it's evolved over time. Christian nationalism has evolved in different ways over time. And unfortunately, the history of religious freedom in the United States is something that we tend to not actually know a lot about. We're not taught about it the way we're taught about other examples of oppression. And so I think there's a lot of value in looking at that history so we can understand contemporary moments and how, in many ways today, we're repeating a lot of behavior that we saw in the 1800s, which is a little bit concerning in my opinion. So just for a couple of examples of reading recommendations, I think it's good to think about, learning about Christian nationalism, thinking about the atheist experience from different people's perspectives, legal battles. My number one recommendation is David Zahet's The Myth of American Religious Freedom. I cannot recommend this book enough. It does a really good job of pointing to the complexity of the history of religion in the United States and the conception of religious freedom. So I highly, highly recommend that book. All right, and now I would love to take anyone's questions. Feel free to ask in the chat, or if you would like to email me, I have my email on the screen. Feel free to send me an email.
Well, thank you, Christina. I really appreciate that. I know I think you're sort of defining and putting out the differences between Christian nationalism and theonormativity. The difference was interesting to me, and I think part in some of the using some correct terms and language. So I appreciate that. Daniel asked, he said, in countries where atheism is more dominant, like Norway, is there atheist normativity?
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that I would love to look more into. And this is something that is thinking about how religious normativity manifests in different countries. I'm not sure if any country, I think that maybe to an extent, actually, I would say potentially, but I just haven't researched enough to be able to confirm that for sure. But I think that'd be a fascinating area of research that I would love for someone to look into.
And then there was an anonymous comment about the Supreme Court, and I just wonder, I'm going to change it up a little bit, looking sort of at from the frame of theonormativity, like what sort of I think what's important in knowing about the Supreme Court and looking at it from that lens.
Yeah, so I think this is actually one of the things that's really frustrating. And just real quick, I saw someone ask for the book recommendations again, so I'm going to go back a slide just so that those are back up again. But this is where it's so frustrating to look at legal cases, because what you see judges constantly say when it comes to people challenging, like in God We Trust is the most common one, but also under God, is the way that judges will say, oh, like the history of this, like there was no coercion in this. This was not about excluding anyone. Where if you look at the discourses surrounding the application, they were very clear that the goal was to exclude atheists from the conversation. There was concern that when In God We Trust was first put on coins, for example, there was very explicit, like, we don't want people to think we're a heathen nation, things like that. And so it's quite frustrating because judges will often give this incomplete, inaccurate history in the way they're talking about it. And then they consistently will say that In God We Trust or Under God clearly do not promote one religion. Yet you constantly see examples of Christian nationalists using those exact pieces of legislation to justify their argument that here's proof that we are a Christian nation. So unfortunately, based off legal precedents, I don't think the Supreme Court is, or really most courts are overly inclined to challenge those things. And it's quite frustrating.
Yeah. And I think in talking about the Supreme Court and how they rule cases, and you sort of alluded to this a little bit in your presentation and the sort of question there. I really see that they're looking at it from a Christian framework rather than a religious framework, because I think, and oftentimes, if the coach that was kneeling on the field praying with the students was Muslim, I feel like we'd have a very different response. Can you sort of address and I think it's a little bit maybe between theonormatism and Christonormatism, like how are minority non-Christian religions impacted by this as well?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question, and one that I'm still playing with, in the sense that like theistnormativity is this weird, almost like it's like an appeal to pluralism. Like we want to be inclusive. So I think what you end up getting is people who genuinely want to be more pluralistic using this theistnormative language because they do view it as inclusive. But then you also see people who are more kind of religious exceptionist use it in a way to specifically push their agenda, which tends to, in the United States, privilege Christianity. And so it creates this really like complex, messy understanding of what religion and religious privilege looks like. The way that I kind of like to explain it is that there's almost this like ideal center, and the closer you are to the ideal center, the more like American you are. So like to be a white Protestant Christian is probably like the most ideal, and the further away you get from that, the more deviant you are. So a Muslim, for example, is fairly far away from that. A atheist is far away. Like a Black atheist would probably be like one of the furthest away from that ideal center. And so I think like when we talk about these ideas of normativity, again, it's really important to think about those intersecting identities, because they're going to mean that people experience the marginalization in different ways.
Yeah, and talking a little bit about the intersectionality, there were several comments in the chat as you were talking about how a lot of this can be used for other identities besides just religion and the framework that you're discussing. And it's sort of, as you were talking, it sort of dawned on me that in all, like if we look at LGBT, if we look at the treatment of women in our society, if we look at sort of race, it's there, why they intersect, it's all still in that religious paradigm and how people are described in the Bible, or how people use the Bible to describe people and those sorts of things. And so River said, he goes, can you talk about the parallels between theonormativity and like cis heteronormativity and like individual groups and those norms and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all related in different ways, and I think that the notion of muted group theory kind of ties into these are all groups that have to come up with language to describe their experiences. And then when you have people with intersecting identities, it's you draw a lot of comparisons, but you also sometimes have to make choices over which identity are you going to focus your energy on, because when you have multiple marginalized identities, it's even more emotionally exhausting. But I think again, these are, I think, very closely together. And I think of things like when someone says something like, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, that's a great example of kind of Christonormative discourses, because you're assuming that the other person is going to buy into these Christian, particularly conservative Christian logics to buy their argument. But if that person's not Christian, then that argument is irrelevant. But that doesn't matter in that person's discourse. And so you see things like that happen a lot. And I do think that you end up seeing theistnormative and Christonormative logics being used to justify marginalizing other groups. That's one of the things I talk about in the paper that I just published with the Christian nationalist group. One of my favorite examples is in talking about the recent voting bills in Georgia. At one point, they were proposing preventing any type of voting on Sundays, which clearly targets Black voters. And someone in Congress had asked, like, how could you possibly justify this? And one of the Republican Congress members stood up and said, this is a dollar bill. It says, in God we trust. The Bible says to keep the Sabbath holy. But that's a very kind of white Protestant understanding of keeping the Sabbath holy, where if you look at the Black Protestant tradition, voting and getting election events together on Sundays is absolutely part of their religious tradition. And so it's very much understanding Christonormativity from a very white lens. And so there's a lot of intersecting issues there.
Yeah, and I will be guilty of, the Adam and Steve, or Adam and Steve rather than Adam and Eve. And you realize then, yes, I'm reinforcing that same, normativity, even within that. What Bob asked, he says, can you just the difference again between theonormativity and theistnormativity?
Yeah, so theonormativity is like the broad term. So theonormativity is like the normalization of religion broadly. And then theist normativity is I would say it's a type of theonormativity that specifically normalizes this idea of belief in God. So it puts a lot of emphasis on God. So for example, like religion is normalized in the United States, but the way religion is understood in the United States is very much in theistic terms. It's very theist normative in that sense, where you can have atheistic religions. So this can explain how, like, something like the Satanic Temple, for example, they identify as a religion, they're acknowledged as a religion by the IRS, but because they're largely atheistic, people oftentimes say, you're not really a religion because you're atheist. That's a very theist normative understanding of religion. So that's why I think it's useful to think of theist normativity as just a form, and then Christonormativity as another type of theonormativity that just more focuses on the privileging of Christianity.
Amy asks, do you think that atheists from non-Christian faiths feel the theonormativity impact less than they do, than they are used to being a minority?
Can you repeat that question?
Do you think atheists from non-Christian faiths feel that the theonormative impact less since they are used to being a minority?
I wouldn't say they feel the impact less. I would say they feel it differently. I think because they already have another level, it comes back to that, like, almost like how much emotional energy can we spend on any marginalized identity? And so I think if you're already originally from a marginalized identity, that might feel slightly different. That's a really good question. I think it's one I have to think about in a little bit more detail. And I'm thinking, like, specifically, like, I think it would depend on the religion largely and what religious minority we're talking about. I think, like, for example, I know people who are ex-Muslims who still, like, they definitely feel this pressure to pass as Muslims still strongly. So I think it just depends a little bit on the religion itself. And in some ways, I would almost think that maybe they feel the pressure more because if you're already part of a marginalized group and you leave that group, there's a greater fear of sense of loss of community, potentially. So I think that's a really good question. I'd have to think a little bit more about it. So I'm glad you brought it up. But those would be my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I relate really what you said, because they're being in a minority religious group and losing that community, but then being in a majority Christian normative group would put really different aspects on it. Because
when I remember someone telling me this issue of, like, they were an atheist in the military, and they had a friend who was an atheist, but their friend was of Arab descent. So people oftentimes assume that he was a Muslim. So he'd have to decide whether to pass as Muslim or say he was an atheist, and, like, which one is worse. And, like, so they were in a really weird situation in that there. And so, yeah, I think that it's a very good question that points to that, again, that complexity of identity.
Helen asks, how do you define religion?
That is a fantastic question. And honestly, I sometimes really struggle to define that. And I think I look at work in religious studies that looks at, there's so many different ways to define it. I personally tend to understand religion as broadly an understanding, an organized understanding of how humans got here, what happens after they die. But it's honestly a definition that I massively struggle with, because even that is like, well, then is atheism a religion if it's organized? Not really. Like, does religion have to involve a higher power? A lot of religious scholars say no. And this is like one of the most interesting things that I do when I teach religion classes. Is one of the first things I ask students is define religion. And it's so hard to define, and I don't even have a definition for it yet, which is super frustrating. But in my work, I really look at how just dominant discourses define it. And in the United States, they define it largely as theistic. And oftentimes it's defined in very much Protestant terms. There's another scholar named Tisa Wenger who has a book, and I can't think of the name of it, but it's about religious freedom, where she talks about how primarily it's Protestant. It's been people with kind of the Protestant elites in the United States who've been able to define what counts as religion. So they got to decide when Mormonism really counted as a religion. They got to dismiss some groups as not really a religion. At one point, Judaism was more understood as an ethnic identity rather than a religious identity, and how that shifted over time. And she does a really good job of kind of parsing out the complexity of how religion gets redefined within the United States. But yeah, I don't have a specific answer to that, which is so frustrating as someone who studies religion.
Cynthia says, is what you're sort of talking about counter I had it. Oh, thank you. And have you ever looked at the work of James C. Scott?
I've not looked into him specifically, but I do talk about hegemony a lot. In the sense that if I'm understanding it the same way, the way that I use it is hegemony is this notion that within any culture, there's particular ideologies that become so dominant, they're framed as common sense, to the extent that even those who are hurt by those ideologies accept them as common sense and don't fight back against them, which I think is exactly how normativity works in many ways. So while I haven't looked at that specific scholar, I've looked more broadly at Antonio Gramsci, and who originally proposed the concept of hegemony. And I think it's a really useful term for understanding how people who are even marginalized or don't notice their own marginalization through the way that dominant culture frames reality.
There are a couple of questions, just a little bit about your sort of dissertation, and sort of the process was, did they challenge your assumptions and conclusions and that sort of stuff? And then sort of a side note is also, where can people get access to your research to learn, to read about a little bit more?
Yeah, so I was quite fortunate. My committee was really quite supportive of my research, and I did both my master's degree and my PhD at Colorado State University, and I had a religiously diverse committee. One of my greatest mentors she's a pretty Christian woman, but she's very supportive of this research. Found it really fascinating. And I think for them, what they consistently said is, reading it is like, they just had never thought about the marginalization of atheists before. And they were just constantly shocked, because I do a lot of my dissertation specifically was looking at how under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the way that Christian nationalism played a role in that. And the way that people resisted it, people from all religions resisted it, was really important. And so that was like, my committee was more just like, wow, like, how do we not know this history? Which was really cool. In terms of where you can access it, if you have a university email address, you should be able to use Google Scholar, EBSCOhost, or request anything that I've done through Interlibrary Loan. If you don't have a university website, sometimes things are a little bit trickier to get a hold of, but you can feel free to email me, and I'm happy to send copies. But if you do have a university email and you go directly to it, it always helps me, because the more views I have, it kind of just looks like my research is getting to people, so that's always nice. But you can always, like I said, here's again I'm going to pop back to the next page if you would like to read anything. I also have a few articles that have been published on the website The Conversation, which are all shorter articles. I have one that looks at the history of the marginalization of atheists in the United States, thinking about how 7 states today still have it on their books technically that atheists can't hold public office, and these are unconstitutional. But the fact that we have it in 7 states, that on the Constitution that atheists can't hold public office, and your politicians don't care enough to remove that, kind of shows how atheists are still marginalized. Because if we had any state that said that women couldn't hold public office, I'm pretty sure Congress members would be falling over themselves to get rid of that clause. But atheists, they're not a group worth fighting for. I have another article that looks at the Christian nationalists and the In God We Trust, and then one that looks at the is largely framed as the story of Walter Plywaski, who was an atheist who was denied citizenship in the 1950s, and kind of the history of the marginalization of atheists in that legal context. So The Conversation is the name of that website again.
And we sort of talked a little bit beforehand, and as we said, we'll be sending out, for all those people that register, we'll be sending out a link to the video so that you can watch again, share it with other people. And Christina said that she will be happy to give me some links to a recent article that was just published, and some other things that we can also share the titles of the books as well. So we'll send that information in the next couple of days, and we send the link to the video. There's we had a couple more questions that we sort of didn't get to. Is there anything on there? We're coming close to time, so I don't know if there's anything specific that you wanted to address real quick. I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's as well.
Yeah, I think, I haven't had a chance to look at it really very that closely, but I think someone asked me how do I handle my first name, and that's I always think it's so ironic that my name does mean female Christ, but I like to say it's spelled with a K, so it's that's a great question. I appreciate that. But I think, I've seen a couple of things thinking about and I'm having a hard time reading the chat while thinking at the same time, but before there were a lot of people who were commenting on some of the advertising, concern about the language itself. And even in this conversation, one of the things that you come up with a word and then you realize afterwards people have a hard time saying it, which is really hard. But again, I think Stedman's theonormativity is a little easier to say, and it gets to the similar idea. And so I think one of the things I really want to emphasize, for me, especially as a scholar, is I am open to other ideas and other suggestions, and is there language that's easier and more accessible? It's something that I'm constantly playing with. So I love these conversations. I'm open to these conversations. I think these are definitely the types of issues that groups as a whole need to work together to discuss. And I think it's hard too. One of the challenges with when you're trying to resist being muted is our experiences are so diverse. So how do we find language to describe that experience and that fits for everybody? And I think it's just a conversation that needs to happen. And so I love having those, and I'm really open to people reaching out. I'm traveling for the next couple of days, so if you do reach out to me, I might not respond until next week. So please know I'm not ignoring you. I'm just traveling and tired. But I love these conversations for sure.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to reading a little bit more about the muted group theory. And I think that applies, as we've sort of talked about here, not only to sort of the atheist, non-religious community, but in much broader senses as well, especially in this country.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. I want to thank you so much for being here and sharing this information with us. And thank you for everyone who's attending. So